Thank you, Jerry. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. There are rare occasions when you have the opportunity to introduce a professional that you admire so much. Therefore, I consider myself very lucky and honored to introduce Matthew Carter for the second time in our lives. The first being at the ATypI back in 2014 in São Paulo. I must say, this is probably one of the most appropriate matches for an opening keynote. ATypI is bringing back Matthew to the city that he once called home at the very early stage of his career. Since he lived in Antwerp, there were many developments and achievements that you can easily find in printed and online media, including a TED Talk and a Wikipedia entry. Some of Matthew's designs are used countless times every day around the globe. Whenever I have to explain to someone what type design is, very often I refer to Verdana and Giorgio as examples of typefaces they would recognize and make it easier to understand. Also, when talking about custom type design, even though Bel Centennial is an old case, it's still very relevant as a reference of great success. Surely, others share the sentiment and the experience. Matthew's first typeface release was so long ago that he doesn't even remember the year. And to this day, he keeps creating history and pushing designs forward. Just this evening, new versions of Mandinia and Sophia were released by his foundry, Carden & Cone, at Type Network. The typefaces include beautiful ligatures and other special features. Matthew is unstoppable, and we are very glad for that. Matthew is not only admirable as a professional, but also as a teacher, partner, mentor, and friend. He seems to be always available for a good conversation. Last year at ATypI, Amy Papelias interviewed the attendees in Montreal and asked which type designer they wanted to have dinner with. Not surprisingly, the most common answer was Matthew Carter. Some people might feel intimidated and unsure about starting a conversation with him, but I encourage you to, because you're certainly in for a treat. The truth is, Matthew Carter can bridge technologies, media, borders, and cultures. He's generous, kind, humble, adaptable, and so much more. Matthew, I am sorry, but I will quote Tina Turner and say, you're simply the best. As part of the Type Network team, who's proudly sponsor ATypI and this keynote, it is my pleasure to welcome Matthew Carter to this stage.
Yeah, I've been to 33 ATypIs. I've given 10 talks. In the course of giving 10 talks, I think I've said everything I know. So I've had to sort of go back and look at some of the early ones. And one in particular I thought might be appropriate for this evening. It's about experimental type design and typography. I first gave a version of it 24 years ago, so very few, if any of you were there on that occasion. You know, in the early 90s, there was an explosion of experimental type design. Ultimately, of course, because of the coming of the personal computer, but more specifically because it was provoked by the arrival of an open version of the PostScript Type 1 font format, which happened either late 89 or early 90. I can never remember exactly when. So you, sitting at your kitchen table with a Mac, could at that point, with Fontographer, which came out with a Type 1 version very quickly, you could sit down and make a typeface that would display, that would render exactly the same as an Adobe typeface or a Bitstream typeface and so on. This was referred to at the time as the democratization of type design. Everyone designed a typeface in the early 90s. I mean, there was a sort of feeling of ferment. Many went on to other trendier things, but there was a sort of explosion of type design at that point. This was wonderful. I mean, I loved this. My only quarrel with it was a feeling that a lot of people had and expressed that experimental typography began with the Mac. you know, it was a digital phenomenon. And that's really not true. I mean, we have the authentic version of type history, I mean, the sort of iconic thing that we all know, beginning with Gutenberg running through Comic Sans. But simultaneously to that, there was a sort of second thread aside from the mainstream that was very, very prolific and very important. So my title slide is from Willem Sandberg's Experimenta Typographica. My copy is well thumbed, as it should be. There's a sense in which, you know, the first instance of any style of type is experimental. It breaks new ground. Gutenberg's type was an experiment in forging manuscripts, a rather successful one, as it turned out. But rather than Gutenberg, I thought we should go back to the genesis of all of this, back, in fact, to God. This is from the Vatican specimen of 1628. And you see it's Adam's alphabet. That's Adam of Adam and Eve fame. And it says he was divinely taught, the first inventor of science and letters. So you could say this was sort of the first custom font, art directed by God. It's not, it's frankly not very good, but I don't know. So coming down the pecking order of beatitude, this is how angels communicated. This is the angelic script from the Kabbalah. And further down, still in the pecking order, a saint, Sir Thomas More. More wrote a book called Utopia, which described the ideal state. And of course, the ideal state should have the ideal alphabet, the utopian alphabet. And More provided that. It's rather charming. In the very first edition of Utopia, there's a note from the printer apologizing, saying the font wasn't ready yet. But by 1518, it was, and was in like the third edition. This, of course, is a reprint from the Chiswick Press. So this utopian alphabet made another appearance 11 years later in Champfleury by Geoffrey Torrey, a cult book. It was really a study of the geometrical construction of classical Latin capitals, Attic capitals, as Torrey called them, which were being sort of rediscovered at the time of the Renaissance. But it had an appendix on other alphabets, Greek, Arabic, and so on, which included the utopic, as you see there. In other words, he copied More's utopian typeface. You see at the top, volontaire. What he means by voluntary, of course, is this is a made-up alphabet. It's artificial. So my copy of Champfleury, it's a facsimile, obviously, has some set-off from the facing page. And what you see in this sort of palimpsest is another made-up alphabet. This is the prototype of those things that every art school student has to go through, where they're told to go out and find something that looks like an A, something that looks like a B. You know, the G is always a glasses like that and so on. Well, blame it on Torrey, because this, as far as I know, is I don't know what all these things are, but evidently to Torrey, they represented everyday objects that looked like letters. So I show you the divine, the angelic, the utopian, ordinary alphabets to make the point that although making up alphabets, concocting alphabets as a sort of heavenly pastime, efforts to replace or reform our alphabet, the Latin alphabet, have been a bust. Our alphabet has been stagnant for way before there was type. And this in spite of, you know, the reformers' zeal and a good deal of logic. So this is an attempt by an Italian poet, Giorgio, actually in the same year as Champfleury, 1529. Type designed by Arrighi, no less. And this was the first typeface in which J and V were used as consonants. You know, up until then, I served both as a consonant and a vowel, so did you. So that caught on. I mean, we still use J's and V's, of course. But another idea of Chissino's, which was to introduce a second E and a second O, you can see Greek-looking E and omega-looking thing there, that did not catch on. So this was sort of a partial success. I mean, he was writing Italian, not Greek. This is vernacular typography. Here's another example of a sort of attempt at a national style, Grandjean's Civilité, astonishing piece of type founding, imitating the handwriting of the day, thought by Grandjean to be specifically French. You see the word François down at the bottom there. And it was aimed for really children, for books to teach children good manners and so on. This is from a remarkable book called Typographical Printing Surfaces by two engineers, Legros and Grant, and I'll have more to say about it in a minute. But one of the things they suggested was that because the combinations TH and NG are so common in English, that aligning them into digraphs would produce huge economic savings in composition and perhaps paper consumption. I mean, think of the forests that we would have saved if in 1916 we had adopted TH and NG digraphs. You know, 3%, if you told a newspaper proprietor you were going to save him 3% on his newsprint bill, he would be ecstatic. So, yeah, here's one of the most famous experimental alphabets, Wim Kraule's new alphabet, 1967. I include it partly because I wish I'd been the wit who said it's the only typeface that needs subtitles, which it sort of does. Wim once told me that he'd sort of forgotten why he'd done this, you know, but I'm glad he did, because it was an attempt to do a typeface, obviously, that was sympathetic to the digital formula. I mean, all horizontals or verticals, which actually, if you've ever edited bitmaps, is the last thing you want in a digital typeface. So, God bless Wim. It's a very honorable piece of work. So, you know, although wholesale alphabet reform has never caught on, one aspect keeps drawing designers back to reinvestigate it. And that is the fact that we actually have two alphabets. We talk about the Latin alphabet. We've got two of them, large and small. They used to be in separate cases, one above the other. So this next segment of my talk is really about sort of battle of the cases. You know, caps and lowercase, they sound the same. Why do you need different forms for them? So a lot of people have investigated this experimentally. This is a face by an Englishman called Charles Ricketts from 1903, part of the English private press movement. Veil Press was the name of his press. You see, it has capitals, but the lowercase includes various capital forms, F, G, R, T, and so on. Ricketts stubbornly said he liked this typeface, but he admitted that it was viewed by all with execration. I actually quite admire it. I mean, if you're going to have a private press and a private typeface, go for it. You know, I mean, do whatever you want. And there's a certain audacity in this that I think is creditable. Two typefaces by, I think, a highly underrated type design, S.H. de Roos, Dutch designer, of course. Both of them based on uncial script. You know, uncial is a genuinely capless form of lettering. Libra, which I think did quite well as a typeface. And this one, Simplex, which 24 years ago, no one had digitized this. I'm pretty sure they have done by now. But as you see, it's a sans serif uncial, very unusual thing. So, as I say, I think Shirt de Roos was a more interesting type designer than he's generally given credit for. And Teterow deserved a lot of credit for publishing these faces at the time. Well, yes, Peño, my God, by Casson. What an amazing job, 1937. This must be one of the most successful of all experimental types, I think. Still in use frequently. You know, when I take the subway in Boston, there's a sign on the platform about something, fairs or something. It's set in Peño, for goodness sake. It has caps, but it has this odd hybrid lowercase with sort of semi-capitalized letters. It has the name of Peño, Charles Peño, who commissioned it from Casson. And I'm glad to mention him because, of course, the Charles Peño Prize will be awarded this year, and it's worth remembering what an innovator Charles was, as was his father, Georges Peignot, who, Georges Peignot commissioned typefaces from the great Art Nouveau designers like Grasset and Georges Ariol. But Peignot worked with Cassandre. They used to tell me in the in the foundry at the Bernier Peignot that Cassandre never made real drawings. He would, he'd come in with an envelope with things noodled on the back of it and go, so do this, and so, very sort of disorganized in a way. Although I think, this is. I think I have another slide of this. Oh yeah, this is Maximilian Vox. I mean, a typeface like this, it just begs for this kind of, it's not a very good slide, but this kind of use. So this is Jan Tschichol's exquisite single case light line sans, designed under Bauhaus influence, in search of purely functional forms purged of all sentimental and historical baggage. But I must confess, this is actually not Tschichold himself. It's a digitization that I did of his face a very long time ago, and it was a very interesting exercise to digitize this. It looks like very strict geometry, but you get into that, and I tell you, it's very subtle. The circles aren't circular, and so on. So I enjoyed digitizing this, but it was quite a challenge, and I love the face. It's by far my favorite of the various attempts in the sort of Bauhaus force field to design typefaces. Tschichold had a fabulous eye. So here's a knockoff, a rip-off of Tschichold. The only thing is, it was done by Dürer in the 1520s. So yes, it's plagiarism, but it's anticipatory plagiarism, which is just as bad as the other kind, as you know. So this is, I think it was Bill Dwiggins's, William Madison Dwiggins's last type design, Winchester, from 1946. During the Second World War, linotype had no brass for making mats. It all went into munitions, and Mergenthaler were doing war work anyway. So Wad was sort of put out to graze and had an opportunity for doing some work which didn't have to be quite so production-oriented and so on. So he did some experimental work, and this Winchester face is quite interesting, I think. He was looking for a specifically English form of letter, as distinct from Latin. In other words, he was doing a rather similar thing to Trissino and Grandjean. To me, it looks not English, but Anglo-Saxon, because of various forms that he used. But it's a very interesting experiment. Never produced commercially by linotype. The printing trade is very conservative. Why? Because readers are very conservative. That's just a fact of life. Disturbance by Jeremy Tankard, who's here, done when Jeremy was a student at the Royal College. Again, playing with the relationship between capitals and lowercase in an experimental manner. And Susannah Lichko's Variex, another single case face. I like Variex very much, and you seldom see it. Single case, as I say, doesn't have capitals, but it has more than one weight. So if you need to emphasize a letter, like as though it were a capital, you can set it in a heavier weight. So those were all examples of this ongoing experimentation with the relationship between upper and lowercase, which, we struggle with the whole time. Next section is experiments with another fraught relationship, Roman and italic. In an essay called Towards an Ideal Italic in 1926 by Stanley Morison, he suggested that the best marriage with Roman was not made by a conventional cursive italic, but by a sloped version of the Roman itself. This was not an entirely novel idea to Morison, although I'm not sure if he mentioned this. This is work from the French Academy of Sciences in the 1690s, exploring, again, sort of idealized type. And it's a very fascinating piece of work. You see that some of it is purely slanted Roman, it's just a sheer distortion. But there are some cursive characters in there, the C and the E and so on. So those academicians who had no background in type, really, printing, You know, they were thoughtful guys. Obviously, sans serifs and to a large extent slab serif italics are simply sloped versions of Roman. But with old-style serif faces, that's not true. Well, when Morison published this article, two noted type designers took him up on it, Jan van Krimpen and Dwiggins, Bill Dwiggins. This is Van Krimpen's Romulus sloped Roman. Extremely unsuccessful experiment, if I may say so. And even Jan, I think, eventually unbent a bit and admitted that Morison had led him astray, and Romulus was given a sort of genuine italic. I don't have a slide of Dwiggins' Electra, but that was also a failure commercially and was given Electra cursive, you know, a more conventional italic. But Bruce Kennett, in his recent book on Dwiggins, which I strongly recommend, makes an interesting point. You know, where these slanted Romans failed was when they're used within a Roman text for emphasis or a foreign word or something or other. If you set a whole story in a slanted Roman, it reads perfectly well, and Bruce put an example of it in his book. You know, you can read slanted Electra perfectly well as an alternative to Roman. Well, if not slanted Roman, what about upright italic? Of course, very suave Italian design of the 1540s. And there were others, you know, a lot of early italics, both type and written italics were upright. I think there are two contemporary exponents of italic uprightness, one being Gerard Unger, who's here. Flora, I think, is a very beautiful piece. You see upright cursive. And Gerard also used an upright italic in Oranda, which he designed for us at Bitstream. I think that also eventually had a more conventional italic. The other contemporary exponent is really Jose Mendoza. And this is a typeface of Jose's called Sully Jonquière. I must have snipped some pieces out of an Italian magazine for my scrapbook here. It has a couple of weights. It's very debonair, like its designer, like Jose. So, if italics look good uprighted, why not push them further counterclockwise? This is Taglienti showing off, piece of calligraphic virtuosity, 1530. And there were a few 19th century what were called Contra italics, but only one masterpiece of the genre from the great Vincent Figgins. I don't know if any of you ever tried designing a back-slanting italic. It's incredibly difficult. All your instincts are shrieking. But Vincent Figgins was up for it. Well, you'll not be surprised, given all of this, to know there have been italics that slope both ways at once. This is from Urban Weiss in Zurich, 1549, I think. And it's still going on. This is from Jonathan Heffler. I guess a slow day in the office, probably. But it has back slanted and both slanted. And it comes with a note from Jonathan saying you should never use this above 3 point. But I think he's being excessively modest. It's really nice. So yeah, Roman and italic. I don't know what the answer is to that. We keep hacking away at that. Next category for experimentation is what I've called the space legibility equation. In other words, how much type, how many words can you get into a given space? We're talking about copy fitting, obviously. This is a new mode of printing invented in 1804 by an Englishman, Philip Rusher. So you see how Rusher got his greater spatial economy on the right-hand side by removing the descending strokes of G, J, P, Q, Y and cramming the lines together vertically. I think I have a second slide. Yes, here is a passage in Rusher's face. Well, he was outdone about 80 years later by James Millington, whose font compacted both descending and ascending strokes into this solid mass. So yes, it saves a great deal of space, but you can't read it. You may know this space, you may not know those previous spaces. Those slides came from some slides. Hobo, by Maurice Fuller Benton in his prime, is on many people's list of most detested typefaces. But I actually admire it because it's a genuine experiment in descenderlessness. You can see from the P and the G in the middle there. Obviously, I mean, this is a display face. It had a 10-point, oddly enough. But, you know, obviously, this was done in order to make the face as big as possible on the body and to stack it in headlines and so on. So, you know, you may not, this may not be your favorite typeface, but I think it was an interesting piece of work, thoughtful piece of work. So I showed earlier the proposed digraphs, space-saving digraphs for TH and NG. They were, as I said, from a book called Typographical Printing Surfaces by Legros and Grant. It's always just called Legros and Grant. And Legros and Grant was the Bible of hot metal type founding and a very substantial book. Mr. Stanley Morison told me once that I should read Legros and Grant from cover to cover once a year. I've never done that because on top is War and Peace, down below is Legros and Grant. It's a pretty big read. Normally I would do absolutely everything, Mr. Morison told me, but on this occasion I disobeyed him, I'm afraid. I've never read it from cover to cover, although I probably have read most of it one way or another. It's a great book. So one of the things that Legros and Grant did was to experiment with measuring legibility. To do this, they overlapped similar letter forms in the lowercase and measured the extent of the overlap and the extent of the difference. You know, if you put a C over an O or an E over an O or a C over an E, obviously they have a lot in common, but there are parts of them that are, that don't overlap, obviously. So they measured this. If they measured anything, it was what psychologists call discriminability of the letter forms. And we're in the presence of some howling experts on legibility, and I don't know where the research is at the moment. At one time, we thought we read just by recognizing word shapes. My impression from talking to Kevin and others is that we're looking a little bit more closely at parsing individual letter forms. So I don't say that this approach will come back into fashion. But, it's not without a certain interest. Two astonishing results from this research that Legros and Grant undertook. One of them is this typeface, Blackfriars, which they said was the most legible typeface. In other words, it was the letters in this typeface were the most discriminable, most disambiguated, to use a $2 word. I've never seen, outside of this specimen, I've never seen Blackfriars used. It didn't exactly catch on. Then the other splendid result from this research is this. This is the mean resultant character. In other words, they took all the lowercase letters, piled them on top of one another, and what they came up with was this ludicrous factoid, which they published in their book. Well, this odd-looking thing reminded me of this very splendid piece of work. This is Ed Feller's Feller Parts. And, it's a font without being a face. In one way, it's very unconventional, but in another way, it's splendidly conventional because, you see, it has caps and small caps. I mean, how cool is that? Ed Feller is way ahead. Another conclusion that Legros and Grant came to, it's true, and they're not the only people who thought this, is that the upper part of a line of type is more easy to read than the lower part if you slice it in half horizontally, as they show here. Tops of letters are arguably more important to legibility, therefore, than their nether parts. I will tell you an anecdote now that illustrates this. I have to do some acting. In Oxford, the city of Oxford, there's a river that runs through Oxford University. And a short distance upstream from the university is a sharp bend in the river. And this used to be set aside, it's probably all changed now, but it used to be set aside for men to bathe in naked, which they like to do. So as you approach this bend, there are prominent signs on the bank asking all women to kindly disembark from their boat, walk across the narrow isthmus of land. Their men friends would bring the boat round, and they would re-embark and go on their way without disturbing the gentlemen who were bathing. But of course, either by accident or not by accident, occasionally a boatload of women would appear in front of the bathing gentlemen to cause huge consternation as they splashed about in the river naked. And this occurred on one occasion when a very distinguished Oxford professor, historian, A.J.P. Taylor, was bathing or about to bathe with an undergraduate student friend. You know, they were ready to dive in when, horror of horrors, a boat appears with women in it. So both men reacted, of course, but they reacted differently. The young man did this. Professor Taylor did this. Afterwards, you know, when the danger had passed, the women had gone out of sight, the young man said to Professor Taylor, you know, I noticed your reaction. And he said, young man, I don't know about you, but at Oxford, I'm generally recognized by my face. So type is not the only thing that is more legible above the baseline. You know, our descenders are not very legible, or most of them. Otherwise, the art of portraiture would be very different. So this idea of, you know, tops and bottoms was taken up by a number of people quite seriously. This is from photo lettering in New York, from their alphabet thesaurus specimen, pages of what they call zip-top fonts, which look as though they've been turned upside down and shaken, you know, so all the weight goes to the top. The center of gravity has gone up. And this was perfectly serious undertaking because they thought it was an aid to legibility and the speed of reading. And you get more than a hint of this in Excoffon's Antique Olive, of course. Here's the A. He told me, and I think he said this publicly, that this was deliberate. I mean, moving the center of gravity of the letters up, he thought made them more legible, and so he did this, as you see, in Antique Olive. So treating the tops and bottoms of letters separately is not new. Again, I showed you some work by Urban Weiss of Zurich. Yes, and this Victoriana called Mary Ann Fancy. Her top is serifed and her bottom is sans serif. Very Victorian. And this is Zentralschrift from 1853. And this, as you see, was an attempt to resolve the dichotomy that exists in German-speaking typography between Gothic and Roman. So the top parts of these letters are fracture and the bottom are Roman. Or have I got this the wrong way around? I've got it the wrong way around. Tops are Roman, the bottoms are fracture. This did not resolve the problem, I may say. It's still there. This is Max Kissman's Fudoni, done a long time ago. I need a better slide of this from Max. So these schizoid faces were very much in vogue 24 years ago in this period of rather hectic experiment. Here's another beautiful example of two faces, Dead History and Carmela, by Carmela's dad, Scott McKellar. A very great loss in many ways, in particular, I think, where experimental typography is concerned. So last words on the tops and bottoms of letters goes to Tobias Frere-Jones, who has helpfully cut letters in half so we can plainly see which is which. And here is the result. Typeset. I think Tobias called this Cassandra. I think Cassandra was a prophetess who was fated never to be believed. I don't know what we learn from that. I think Tobias did this when he was still at Rhode Island School of Design, and they may have immediately graduated him when they saw this. So yes, tops and bottoms of letters, and endlessly investigated. Another, of course, fashionable experimental mode is deconstructing letters. This is a minimalist font designed by Brian Coe back in the 60s, I think, at the Royal College of Art. Herbert Spencer had a sort of unit at the Royal College that investigated legibility, and he produced a very good book from which this slide is shot, called Visible Words. They did some interesting investigations. This is from a student who I knew at Yale, Christian Custers, who's taken a typeface of mine, Galliard, and he's sort of left out the bits he doesn't like, I think. It's deconstructed, you know. People used to say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. I wonder if deconstruction is an even more sincere form of flattery. I mean, I don't know. But he really went to work and whittled on Galliard. And a Fuse font from Phil Baines. And I must, of course, mention Fuse, which has a very honorable place in the whole history of experimental type design. It was Neville Brody's brainchild with John Wozencraft. And they did several font packs. I think there used to be, 4 faces in each pack, each one with a poster to illustrate the face. And it went to many, many different packs. And I think they even had a conference, didn't they? They had conferences. I think I went to one. So yeah, this was really, Fuse was a leading vehicle for experimental type for quite a long time, published by Font Shop. So I'll just sort of out of context just show you a couple, 3 more Fuse faces just to make the point that they were highly experimental. Box by Paul Sitch, Scratched by Pierre de Chulot, and Reactor, again by Tobias. This face degrades progressively. The more you use it, the worse it gets. And here's another example of Tobias at work. I think what happened, this is accidental experiments, which again have an honorable place in all of this. I think what happened was Tobias wanted to scale something by 101%, but by mistake he hit 1%. So the letter was shrunk to a tiny dot. He then saw what he'd done, so he enlarged it 1,000%, and what he got was this. I don't know if he did this to all the letters in the alphabet. It's century, as you can see, but he also did the italic, of course. So yeah, you can leave it to the software sometimes to do the experiments for you. Boy, script. Oh no, here's Neville himself, Dirty 4. I suppose what Neville did was photocopy it till it really kind of fell apart. Script types, fruitful source of, by script type, I mean typefaces imitating handwriting. Fertile field for experiment. This is a face, a French face, which I absolutely adore, by Pierre Moreau, first seen in 1642, I think. It's very graceful and daring. You know, it was so far ahead of the field. The financial and engrossing scripts of Fournier and Rosart were products of the next century. It's also a very hairy piece of type founding. It's vertically kerned, for those of you who speak metal. Not always successfully. Do you see how, well, there's an example here. Yes, do you see how the G and the H have collided here? So there's a certain risk in doing this vertical overlapping, that you'll be unlucky and get a couple of letters that collide. So yes, God, Excafons scripts. In particular, this one, Mistral. I think it belongs in a discussion of experimental type design because, first of all, it was made in metal, if you please. And I think it sort of achieved the status of what Giorgio was trying to do with civilité. It became a sort of national French typeface. I mean, you saw this everywhere in France for a period. Very, very splendid piece of work, still very much in use. You see it a lot still. So, yeah, here's a script phrase dating from the period I'm talking about, a quarter of a century ago. Gaijin by Alex Tailovich. And this face, called Remedy, which was an emigre face, designed by Frank Heine. It's from Emigre the book. And this particular typeface, Remedy, oh, here it is again from an emigre specimen. And here's the designer, Frank Heine, asking the same question we've all asked from time to time. So this face, Remedy, and this one, Luscious, designed by Mr. Keedy, these two experimental faces became part of a cause célèbre at the time. They were singled out in an article in iMagazine by Steve Heller called The Cult of the Ugly. And Steve said they were examples of freakishness as an end in itself. Repercussions of this went on actually for quite a long time. Steve called Luscious, this face, a bawdy, shove-it-in-your-face novelty typeface and an affront to, not a parody of, typographic standards. So I think eventually, actually, Steve sort of recanted a bit and so on. But I must say, I'm more forgiving of this kind of thing than Steve is, I think. But I do agree with Robin Kinross, who said that you can find the model for a lot of contemporary experimental faces in Nicolette Gray's book on 19th century ornamental faces. Certainly true of Luscious, I think. One exception Robin made was for this face, Cosmic, by Eric von Lockland, which has several different versions, or 3 different versions of the same letter within the same font to give the sort of informality of hand lettering. Not a completely original idea. I think, yeah, here's a close-up. But what I really like about Cosmic is that it looks as though whoever wrote it tried to get the letters to be the same. They weren't trying to make them different. They were trying to make them the same. And that makes it much more interesting, I think, to me. Nowadays, of course, something like this is being dwarfed by OpenType. But this was rather pioneering work at the time. So yes, Eric has 3 E's, 3 F's, 3 G's. Gutenberg only had 2. So progress is being made. We're getting there rather gradually. So I'm now into my coda. This is a face designed by the great Cassandre, never made. When Cassandre committed suicide in 1968, there was a letter beside him from a German type foundry rejecting this design as being too revolutionary, too experimental to produce for photo composition. Excavant did also an experimental typeface, Excavant book, he called it, that was rejected actually by the same foundry. If you were at Montreal last year, you will know that this typeface will, at last, be produced. Either, I'm not sure whether it will be done literally or slightly edited, but this will see the light of day eventually. Here again, Dwiggins, Bill Dwiggins, 1937, I think. What Dwiggins called the M formula. This was a way of sort of caricaturing the drawing of letters that he learnt from carving the faces of marionettes in his marionette theatre. He called it the M formula. And this is so vivid. I absolutely understand what he was trying to do. Last slide, Template Gothic by Barry Deck. Another emigre face. Barry said, an imperfect typeface for an imperfect world. This was 24 years ago. I don't know if our world has got any less imperfect. I don't think it has, if you look at the world at large. But in our, parochial world of type, I'm not quite sure. I found when I was looking through my slides for this talk, I felt really rather nostalgic for this period of experimentation. I think we're going through a sort of calmer phase at the moment, or have been. I don't know really why that is. It may be that it's because, you know, all young student type designers now, they go to Typomedia, or they go to Reading, or they go to Type at Cooper. They learn to make absolutely professional, wonderful typefaces. They don't mess around with experiments and so on in quite the same way. But, you know, in just the same way that the opening of PostScript Type 1 sort of opened the floodgates to pretty much everything I've been talking about this evening, it may be that the variable font technology will have the same effect. I very much hope it will. There were some indications of this at TypeCon a few weeks ago. And I see that David Berlow is talking later in this conference about work with variable faces, and I'm sure David will have some treats to show us. So that was talk number 11. Over and out. Thank you for your patience over the years.